if he does sign something like this, or our government looks at backing a treaty like this, I think that needs to be a call to action for people. And I'll be honest with you, Sean, there's a lot of people out there that I'm friends with and talk to a lot about this stuff that actually hope he signs it, because it would be the final slap in the face as a wake-up call for a lot of people who've been largely asleep at the wheel for a long time. If that doesn't rattle them out of their slumber, I don't know what would.
Well, that's actually a perfect opportunity to segue to something else here, Marc. I know that you have a lot of contacts in Chicago with the police department around the country. I know that it's been your experience that some of these officers are waking up. Some of these officers are looking at alternative media sources. They know about the fascism. They know about the New World Order. They know about the unconstitutional acts of this government. Why don't you tell folks a little bit about that and give us a glimmer of hope?
Okay, well, the one thing I have to say is guys like yourself, guys like Chris Duane, Kerry Lutz, Gerald Celente, Bob Chapman, who we all miss very much. Folks like you have definitely made an impact in the alternative media. The internet, you and I have talked about stuff like that, and you're making an impact. A lot of these guys are on their own, doing their own research and coming to conclusions about what's really happening out there. And they don't like what they see. And I think the important thing about that is the fact that they are the people on the initial front lines that would be asked to go and do stuff like take people's guns. And a lot of them, maybe they haven't said so verbally to people that they work with, their fellow officers, but they've drawn a line in the sand themselves and said, hey, if it comes down to this, I'm not going to do that.
Let me ask you this. What is the mindset of these individual officers to restrictions of Second Amendment rights? Are these guys generally strong supporters of the Second Amendment?
So, some are and some are not, because, you have a lot of guys that are in law enforcement that, the firearm on their duty belt is just a tool of the trade. They couldn't care less about guns. They're not interested in guns. They're not shooters. They have knowledge of and skill with firearms because it's part of their trade, okay? Where other guys, you have guys that, one of the reasons why they're police officers is because there's an involvement with firearms, and they're just as adamant about the Second Amendment as you and I are. They're avid shooters. They're into it as a sport. So there's a pretty big divide in law enforcement. But I don't think that matters as much as people using their own moral compass to decide what's right and what's wrong, because we could take firearms out of the equation and talk about another subject. If you're asking somebody to do something that's morally wrong to the people that they're tasked with protecting, it's the same thing. So, a lot of these people are really starting to wake up and say, hey, maybe I don't have an opinion, or maybe I do, but the one thing I know for sure is that I know the people that I'm going to be going up against if I need to take their guns, and it's not worth my paycheck to get shot in the process. So whether I agree with it or I don't agree with it, if it comes down to that, I know some shooting is going to start, and I'd rather not be on the wrong end of that.
Okay, now in the time we have left, I would be completely remiss not to touch on some of these things that only a guy like you deep into the industry could tell us about. So let's do like a pop quiz. Let's try to get through these quick. My first question for you is, let's talk about the level of historical gun sales to date.
Okay. We're not quite there in terms of records. The biggest records on record are 08-09. And I think we could eclipse that depending on what happens as a reaction to whatever happens with this UN treaty and or the presidential elections. So if it goes the way that we think it might, we could actually surpass 08-09, but we're not there yet.
Can you give us some numbers, though? Are we talking about still several million guns per month being sold, or is that tapered off a bit?
That's tapered off a bit, and I think the only reason for that is even though the United States is the largest market in the world, it's not bottomless. And I think that one of the things that we're seeing is that the lack of credit and the financial situation in the United States has really affected people's cash flows, and even though there's a lot of demand, the market has been flooded over the last several months, and it is starting to taper off a little bit. But in the industry, we really expect things to really pick up again by September, maybe October, the latest, or if it takes that long, right after the election, depending on who's getting back in there.
Okay, and let's talk about consumer demographics. Who do you think is buying all of these guns, Mark?
Well, Sean, I'm glad you brought that up because I think that is a very, very important thing to discuss. And I think that is probably the biggest insurance policy against gun confiscation that we have going for us. And the reason why I say that, Sean, is because if you look at the demographics of people that are buying, there's really three types of people out there. Guys like you and me who already own firearms that are continuing to buy. People that were gun owners, and I want to explain this because this is important, okay? There has always been a very large divide and conquer mentality with gun owners in the United States. And what I mean by that is, the typical guy who's either a hunter or a skeet or trap shooter that says, hey, I'm a gun owner, what do you need an AK-47 for, okay? That demographic there's a huge change in that demographic. And when I go out and see people at shows or different events, the guys that were, into the shooting sports because, they're a hunter and that's part of the game, or, they're all about accuracy and they've got a 13-pound 22 bolt action single shot rifle and that's what they shoot. A large part of the market right now is folks that never had use for certain types of guns that are buying them in droves. The other part of the market is first-time buyers, which I think is really important for us because you have a lot of females, a lot of single moms, a lot of young couples, people that have never owned a gun before, maybe people even that voted for Obama in the last election, but now they've decided it's probably better to have a gun and not need it than to need it and not have it. That's probably about 30 to 35% of the market right now.
Okay, and to wrap up, let's come full circle and let's talk about current legislation and how the firearms industry may or may not be responding to this potential UN treaty, Mark. We started with the UN treaty. I dove in head first asking you about that. Now, what is the firearms industry doing in your mind in preparation for the possibility of this treaty being signed?
There's not a lot that we can do against something like the UN treaty other than lobby, okay? But I can tell you the fights that the industry is fighting right now are really what I would call backdoor attacks to the Second Amendment. The UN treaty would be more of a front door attack, okay? A backdoor attack is something that's masquerading as gun control that's not even that. Like, hey, we're not going to let you put a range here because of the lead pollution that the range would create, or we're going to masquerade gun control under the guise of public safety, and we're not going to let you open a range gun shop in this part of town because there's a high school a mile and a half away. Or we're going to attack the firearms industry by making them spend a lot of money to develop technology like micro-stamping, where, if the industry was forced to do that, a $400 gun would become an $800 gun. These people, the advocates of gun control, Sean, have become a lot smarter in how they've done things over the last several years. And the thing that really worries me the most is that they can go after ammunition. If you didn't want somebody to drive their car, the easiest thing to do rather than fight them to take it was make it so they couldn't get gas, right? It's the same thing with guns. If you have somebody that has an AK-47 with a 70-round drum, and if he's got no ammo, all he's got is a fancy club. They've realized that, and that's what they're doing. And the thing that really scares me about Obama is that he can executive order restrictions on imports. If he knows that he's not going to get reelected and he wants to give the firearms community and the industry a big screw you on his way out the door, all he has to do is executive sign import restrictions on things like ammo and firearms, and that would be a major, major problem that, there would be no way to fight that at all. So there's a lot of threats out there, and I don't think that the UN treaty is the most, threatening at this point in time.
Well, thanks for all that great information, Mark. I think what I want people to understand, especially those who have a lot of international readers and listeners to these things, about 60% of the audience actually at sgtreport.com is an international audience. And what I want people to understand is that Americans aren't gun crazy because we think guns are neat and we all want to be John Wayne. This isn't a movie. This is reality. The reason I want people to understand that we had this conversation, Mark, is because, as Thomas Jefferson said, No free man shall ever be debarred the use of arms. The strongest reason for the people to retain the right to keep and bear arms is, as a last resort, to protect themselves against tyranny in government. Now, that's why we have our Second Amendment, and that's why we will never let them take our guns. Last word from you, Marc.
Be well-rounded. If you're going to prepare for stuff like this, make sure you have more than guns. I'm tired of hearing people say, if anything happens, I have guns and I'll get whatever I need. Don't be part of the problem. Don't criminalize yourself if it comes down to that. Get everything else you need and can't live without if you really think it's going to come to that.
Well said, Marc. Preparation is key, and that crosses over into all sorts of different subjects and categories, from food to arms to water to shelter to energy. Marc, I can't say your last name, so I can't thank you in the way that I might like. But Marc, on behalf of all of us, we really appreciate your time and your insights here.
Thank you, Sean. It's good to be with you.
Okay, Marc, well, we'll talk again if and when this treaty gets signed, and we'll get an update from you. And let me know if there's any breaking news in your industry. You can come on anytime.
Will do, Sean. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, Marc.
Well, that's it, guys. Thanks for tuning in. And visit sgtreport.com for all the latest. Good night.